All right, good evening, everyone. How are we? Did we all get a good sleep last night from all those tips? Very good. Good to hear. Hope everyone had a good day. Welcome back again to our last part of this health series. And tonight, Dr. Rachel will be sharing about the healing of the mind and eternal wholeness. So I think we're looking forward to this last part of the series. So before we go ahead, we'll just say a quick prayer and then we'll start. Let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that we've had, Lord, that you've kept us safe and kept us safe on our travels here, Lord. Lord, I just pray now that you may open our hearts and minds to the message we're going to hear, and you may give Dr. Rachel the right words to speak, Lord, and that we may learn something to apply into our daily lives, Lord. I pray all this in your heavenly name. Amen. Okay, Rachel, you can have it.
So good evening. I was actually going to give you a little test tonight to see if you all had dementia, but I was beaten to it by someone telling you what the topic was tonight, so I can't test you. All right, so we will be covering both mental health and spiritual health tonight. And although they're my final topics, they are not the least important and probably the most important. And I guess my job tonight, I really wanted to sort of point out that there has been a rather big disconnect between physical, mental and spiritual health that's happened over the last probably a couple of centuries really, but they were never meant to be like that. Physical, mental, spiritual, they are all very much interconnected, very important to each one of them, and possibly spiritual health will probably come out on top if we actually look and see what that does in the long run. So tonight, that's what my job is. Even though they're two separate talks, they're very much related. And I'm hoping that you'll get that message as I share some of the information that I've got here. But first of all, we'll just go into the mending of your mind. So obviously, one of the things that we were taught very early in medical school is that the greatest epidemic of this time would actually be mental illness. So not all the other physical things, but mental illness. And it's true, I probably see at least 80% of the people that come to see me in my practice, definitely mental illness is at some point in their presentation going to be an issue. So I'll just share this little quote from a little lady who penned this more than 100 years ago. Sickness of the mind prevails everywhere. 9/10 of diseases from which men suffer have their foundation here. So this was from over 100 years ago. Now, research has only just confirmed that, and quite thoroughly. In the US, where they had about 80 to 90% of visits to emergency department where there was no physical cause of their symptoms found, they concluded that there was a mental issue going on underneath all of that. So it's 80 to 90%, so that definitely confirms that. Roughly about 80% of all doctors' visits to family physicians or GPs are all related to distress of the mind. And about 70 to 80% of all health-related problems are either precipitated by or aggravated by some sort of mental distress. This includes things even such as acne, type 2 diabetes, things such as herpes viruses, colds, flus, all those immune issues, autoimmune issues, migraines, cancers, all of these things have still got a relationship to some sort of distress of the mind. So it's pretty important that we look at what we can do about fixing that. So what can we do to harm our mind or blow our mind, as I would say? What are the factors that can actually lead to mental health problems? And we're going to look at some of the main ones. Genetics, so there is something that can definitely run in families. You can't really change the inheritance of these factors per se, but you can have something to do about how those genes are expressed. We know that, obviously if you've got first-degree relatives who've got mental illness or a history of depression, suicide, those sorts of things, that will increase your risk of mental illness, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to get that. Developmental, This is more about how you were raised, the environment that you grew up in and how it affected your thinking. So some of these aspects include whether or not you were raised by your biological parents, whether you had some level of abuse as a child. All of those things are really important, or even living with someone who's had some sort of alcohol and drug addiction. Those things can have a big impact on your mental health as you develop. Lifestyle, and we were going to address quite a few things here. There's a whole range of things. We're going to look at diet, we're going to look at lifestyle with your exercise, sunlight, fresh air. All of these things are important, and we're going to have a look at these in more detail later. Your sleeping habits. Now, if you were here last night, you would understand very much how this is related to your mental health. But the rule of thumb is if you're routinely having more than 9 hours or less than 6 hours, you will increase your risk of a whole host of mental health problems. Nutrition, that's part of the lifestyle. We'll look at some more of those things later. Toxicity, I've included this here, even though it's not a huge one, it still does have effect on some people, especially for those who've lived in areas where there's a lot of exposure to lead, for example. Certainly other ones, mercury, arsenic, bismuth, there's lots of other heavy metals that are rarely a problem, but that can be an issue for some. Social complicated grief issues. So this is when you have an absence of social supports, lots of negative life, stressful events, for example, low socioeconomic status. So if you're from a poorer part of the world, all of these things, drug addictions, again, anything that's in the family, losing a loved one, losing anybody that you're close to, all of this can have an effect on your mental health. Medical conditions, we've addressed some of these before, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, anything that's chronic, head injuries as well, all of these things can have an effect on your mental health. And addiction, even though it's mentioned in the context of other things, that alone, so if I have an alcohol addiction, any sort of recreational drug addiction, even addiction to some medications such as sleeping pills, all of these things can have a bad effect on your mental health. And the last but not least on this list is poor frontal lobe functioning. A reason I put there is we're going to actually take a bit more of a detailed look at this one in the next couple of slides. But I think it's important to point out, even though we've got all of these factors that can affect you and lead to mental health issues, it's not usually one alone that does it. Usually you have to have at least 4 of these factors playing together to develop a mental health problem. But let's have a look at our frontal lobe, because this is front and center, literally, in some of our mental health issues that we get. So where is the frontal lobe? So if you look at the picture on the screen, our brain is actually divided essentially into about 4 lobes. You have your frontal lobe that's right at the front there, as it's named. You also have a parietal lobe that sits behind it, a occipital lobe behind that again at the back, and then temporal lobe that sits on the side. Now, it's important to note that this frontal lobe continues to develop from the time you are conceived until you're about 30 years of age. So it's not a static thing. It's something that's quite dynamic, and it will continue to develop. So things that are really impacting on the brain will happen in that period of time quite significantly, so up to the age of 30. It doesn't stop when you're a child. So what does the frontal lobe do? Let's have a look at some of the functions of this. So this is where you will find your will. This is your God-given right to choose. So this is right in that frontal lobe there. It's also where you will develop your morality, your spirituality, your character, your wisdom, your judgment. All of these sort of higher level thinking things are all developed in that frontal lobe. It's also where you will establish your personality, and that's often done in the very first few years of your life. Character tends to happen throughout your life, but personality is developed very early. Your self-expression, your self-awareness, all of those things are developed in that part. Certainly your reasoning, your learning, your problem solving, all of these activities are driven by that frontal lobe. Very complex abstract reasoning in particular, that's all performed there. Planning activities, organisational type things, they're all found in the frontal lobe. Speech and language skills are found there as well. Attention and concentration, it's very important to have a functioning frontal lobe for those things. It's where your working memory is established. Control of your voluntary movements, so the things such as complex fine skills that you develop is all from that frontal lobe. And with respect to mental health, look at some of the things that are written there. So you've got your emotion, your mood, controlling impulses and behaviours, especially the social behaviours, sourcing all your motivation and happiness. All of that is found right in that frontal lobe there. So you can see why it is so important to protect our frontal lobe. It is the part of the brain that we really want to focus on. Has anyone ever heard of the story of Phineas Gage? Yeah, an amazing young man. His story is quite remarkable. He was a foreman in the US, and this is back in the early 1800s. He was a foreman on the railroad, and he was as a manager of sorts, and so he had quite a few workers under him. And one day he was using a tamping iron, and basically it's a very sort of heavy, large rod, and he was packing a hole with gunpowder, and basically the job of this was to basically pack it, seal it, and then they would blow that part of the ground up, obviously to put some more railroads through. So he was in the middle of packing this, and one of his workers called out to him, and he was still sort of tamping away, and as he turned around, he tamped quite in a difficult way, and it set a spark off in the hole, and he was sort of leaning over, turning around to speak to someone, but the whole thing exploded. And so that tamping iron went up through the roof of his mouth, out the top of his head, and landed, tens of metres away. He immediately, obviously, had passed out. They actually thought he had died, but he came to a few minutes later, started talking, and, even though part of his brain was apparently pulsating through the top of his head, other parts of his brain were actually on the ground. So anyway, they packed him into a cart, took him all the way into town to see the doctor, of course. The whole way there, apparently he was actually still recording in his book all the hours that the workers had worked and all sorts of things, so he was still quite functional at that stage. Now, this poor man went through quite a difficult, the next few months, from having abscesses to all sorts of things. But essentially the story is that he lost quite a significant part of his frontal lobe. And from that experience, that's where we learnt a lot of these things about what the frontal lobe does, and a few other things following that in psychology that we've worked out. But he changed. Prior to his accident, he was a very moral, a very upright character. He was a Christian man, very much a family man. Following the accident, his personality changed. He became very crass, very crude. He was no longer able to manage anything. He couldn't concentrate on things. He couldn't plan things. He lost all of the abilities, all these great abilities that he had prior to the accident. And so he was very much a changed man. Now, unfortunately, he only lasted, I think, another 7 or 8 years. He ended up having seizures and dying from that. And he did actually recover some of those abilities with time, so the brain is quite amazing in what it can do. But nonetheless, Phineas Gage has given us a lot of this information about what the frontal lobe can do, based on his experience. So what are some of the mental illnesses that are directly linked to impairments in the frontal lobe? We've definitely got some here. So depression, mania, so that's when you get the bipolar disorder where you go between a depression and a manic state. So the mania is particularly an issue with frontal lobe. Attention deficit hyperactive disorder, which we see a lot in children. So this is the ADHD. Obsessive compulsive disorder as well, which is quite drastic for some people. There are others such as schizophrenia and anxiety, which show some impairments in that frontal lobe, but there's other parts of the brain that do also play a significant role. But these 4 particularly are related to frontal lobe impairment. What are some of the things that we do in our lives that can impair the frontal lobe? So it's not just about what we put in our bodies, but it's also what we're doing. Low carbohydrate diets. So all of these keto diets and these diets that are high in protein, low in carbohydrates, they're really unhelpful for that frontal lobe. So our brain primarily depends on carbohydrates almost exclusively for its energy. So if you are having a low carbohydrate diet, you're going to shut down your frontal lobe. So on the converse to this, so despite the fact we need carbohydrates, if you're having a diet that's high in the processed sugars rather than the complex carbohydrates, you will also inhibit the function of that frontal lobe. It does not like processed sugars. So lots of meat, cheese and rich foods in your diet are also harmful to that frontal lobe. Alcohol, definitely. Alcohol just flat out kills your brain cells. So it is a nasty brain toxin. Caffeine, I'll share a little bit more information on this in the next slide. Media addiction, so things such as gaming, social media, TV, movie entertainments, all of these things have a lot of rapid sequencings in them. All these sorts of things are actually designed to shut down your frontal lobe function. So that a lot of these games and a lot of the social media apps, all of these things have things within them that are designed specifically to shut down the frontal lobe. Pornography causes a huge disconnect between the frontal lobe and other parts of your brain as well. Any sort of syncopated rhythms, particularly that you find in some of the modern music, is also designed to shut down the frontal lobe. Mindfulness, and I'm talking here the Eastern meditation styles. So lots of these are put out there as ways to relax and to help you, but again, the purpose of this is to actually close down that frontal lobe activity. So if you want to avoid that, I suggest you find other forms of relaxation. Mindfulness in terms of the Eastern meditation is not healthy for your frontal lobe. Not getting enough problem-solving activities. So if you want a life of ease, you're not going to develop your frontal lobe at all. You need to do lots of problem-solving activities. Another one that's really interesting, if you don't have a lot of spiritual exercise, remember spirituality is found in that part of your brain. If you neglect that, you're going to neglect some of the development of your frontal lobe. Another interesting one they found to not help with frontal lobe activity is if you go against your conscience. So the more often you do with that, the more often you're going to have issues with the way your frontal lobe functions. All right, caffeine. I have a particular distaste for caffeine because I've experienced it both personally and in my career in terms of what it can do, particularly on the brain. So obviously lots of people use their morning cup of coffee and when they get up they think it's something that they need to get through the morning, but lots of people don't realise how harmful this is. So caffeine does have a significant effect on the blood flow to your frontal lobe. In fact, it shuts down the blood flow by at least 30%. So despite the fact that people think it's making them more alert, you're actually shutting down your blood flow to the frontal lobe. Now, the literature does suggest it has a significant role to play in things such as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and even some of those more strange ones such as the split personality disorder, anorexia. All of those things have been found to be an issue with caffeine. And I think I'll probably just share a story that I have with a patient. This is quite a few years ago. I worked in a mental health unit up in the Hunter region where I came from. I worked on a team, so I was actually the most junior member there. So I had a few psychiatrists in that team, and I was the junior resident, as you would say. And a young man, he was in his early 30s, he came in as a patient, and he was in what we call a catatonic state. And what that means is that he did really nothing for himself. Wherever you would sit him, he would stay, and that's where he would stay. He might just go to the bathroom, and that was about all. He needed help with dressing, eating, all those sorts of things. He wasn't communicating, he wasn't talking. He was severely, severely depressed to the point where he just no longer could look after himself. So he was admitted as a patient to this mental health unit. The plan was for him, because obviously medication wasn't working, he couldn't do any therapy, he was going to have what we called ECT, so electroconvulsive therapy, where they basically sedate the person and put some electrical activity in through the brain and try and recalibrate the brain to get it to work again and hopefully resolve his depression to the point where we could help him. However, to do this, he had to have what we call a workup, a medical workup, to make sure he was fit enough to go through this procedure. And during that workup, it turned out he had a arrhythmia of the heart. His heart wasn't beating in the right beat. So he was deemed unfit for this procedure, and it seemed a rather hopeless case. So as you do, when you have a group of psychiatrists, they all turned to the most junior member of the team and said, "Work out what's going on and come back to us." So it was my job to figure out what we were going to do with this poor young man. And to be honest, I was feeling a little bit helpless about it. I didn't think I'd have any answers. So, I did something that I probably in hindsight, it was probably God-inspired. I thought I'll go back to the basics and figure out what was happening to this man before. What was his life like? And so it turns out he did have a very stressful job. But there was one thing that he was using to deal with his stress, and that was using litres of a caffeinated, carbonated beverage on a daily basis. That was one thing that he was using to try and manage all of the stress, obviously stay awake for long enough, and we're talking sometimes between 4 and 6 litres a day of this beverage. So I thought, well, that might be significant. Maybe if we can stop that, and by the way, it was the one thing that he continued to do while he was a patient. He was having people bring this in so that he continued to drink this as a beverage. It was probably the only real nutrition that he was getting at all. So I spoke to the team. I said, how about we try and wean him off this and see what happens? Maybe this will help. They disagreed with me and said I had no evidence to do so and to let him continue this process. I said, what if I could bring some evidence? So they gave me that opportunity, and I was able to download 40 or 50 articles about how this could potentially affect his mind. So they agreed then to let me do this. So over the next few weeks, I weaned him off this beverage. First and foremost, the arrhythmia of his heart resolved. So his heart got better. That completely disappeared. Within that few weeks, he was starting to talk again. He was starting to dress himself and obviously eat better, all of those sorts of things. And he was able to be discharged without needing ECT. He did have a bit of medication, but he started to talk. He was talking to people. He was able to take care of himself. So it just goes to show you the power of just one simple thing, such as caffeine, can have on both the body, with his heart, and his mind. So thus, I don't have anything good to say about caffeine. It is very harmful, and albeit none of us are probably here drinking that much a day. But I think even a little of it, if we know that it shuts down the flow of the blood to the brain, let's avoid something that's going to harm us to that degree. So, as I said, it will decrease the blood flow to the brain, certain links to anxiety and depression. Now we all know, all of us do know, that it will interfere with our sleep, particularly if you have it within about 6 hours of bedtime. Now, not only does it interfere with your ability to go to sleep, it also interferes with the quality of your sleep. So you won't get that as much of that restorative phase that we were talking about last night. So it's really important to avoid that. Now, despite what people say that it actually helps them with their alertness, the research is actually disagreeing. You might feel like you're more alert, but you actually get impairment in your mental performance. So you won't be able to form such complex processes that you would want to when you're in a work environment. So we know that it's not going to be helpful. And it also makes it a lot more difficult to cope with stress. So that's what the research shows. So you can make up your own mind whether you would like to continue or promote the use of caffeine for other sort of things. So what are some of the other dietary factors? Now, these themes you will hear over and over again because you just can't beat good science here. The whole food plant-based diet has been shown to definitely decrease your risk for both depression and anxiety, and even the concept of brain fog, which we all know about at times. So obviously we talked about this before, the highly processed, very sugar-rich foods, very neurotoxic to the brain. They've been shown to worsen your mood, anxiety, and the ability to concentrate and focus. And if there's any teachers in this room, they will certainly attest to this. If a child comes in from their lunch break and they've had lots of sugar, processed sugars, they're going to have a hard time controlling that child's ability to learn. So we want to reduce our animal-based products. They contain a lot of pro-inflammatory compounds, so things that really inflame the brain, called arachidonic acid. And this will adversely affect your mental health through all of its inflammatory effects. It's particularly found in saturated fats in animal products, and they can make the communication between those nerve cells in your brain a lot more difficult. Now here I want to say include sources of tryptophan. So tryptophan is an amino acid, which is one of the building blocks of proteins, that is used to make what we call serotonin. And if you want to give that another name, it's your happy hormone in the brain. So it's the source that we need. And good sources of tryptophan would include tofu, flax seeds, sesame seeds, almonds, and walnuts. So now if you want to get your walnuts in for that one, it's also good for your omega-3. A very important nutrient, very helpful for both depression and bipolar disorder. And obviously the walnuts are a good source there, and so are the linseeds or the flax seeds. Now, these are all the B group vitamins. Now, a deficiency in any of these can unmask a mental health issue, particularly depression. So it's really important that you get enough of these in your diet. Folate is very easy. Pretty much all of your legumes, your chickpeas, your lentils, red kidney beans, navy beans, all of your leafy greens are fantastic sources of folate. B12, again, if you're looking for a plant-based one, you'll have to go with fortified products. Otherwise, an egg or two a week is more than enough. B6, really good sources of this are avocados, so they're a lovely one, but also your bananas, your sunflower seeds, corn as well, hazelnuts, a few of the whole grains, they're all really good sources of your B6. So what about physical activity? Well, we know that moderate exercise, the type that makes you huff and puff half an hour a day, will halve your risk of developing depression compared to when you're not doing enough exercise or hardly any at all. So, how much we need? Again, 30 minutes, 3 to 6 times a week, and that's for preventing depression. So we know it increases your happy hormone, that's serotonin in the brain. It's also as good as medication and better than counselling in terms of reducing depression. So if you want to get a cheap way to treat your depression, start exercising, it's fantastic. Now we also know it can alleviate anxiety. Any sort of substance abuse disorders, any sort of addictions, and ADHD in those kids, they really do well with exercise, and that's all you need to help prevent and treat those conditions. Sunlight, again, really important for your happy hormone serotonin production, particularly in the daytime. And in areas of the world where they have very shortened days, they often even put them in sort of false sunlight environments so they can actually improve that serotonin there. Obviously, it's not too arduous. We only need about 30 minutes of the early morning sun, so that's the sun around between about 7:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning, depending on the time of the year, but usually within about half an hour of the sunrise, because that's when you get most of that nice blue light to help with that impact on depression. It's also very good, obviously, for your sleep-wake cycle. So water intake. Now, you might not think that does much for your mental health, but we know that it does have a huge impact on your level of alertness, how alert you feel, your thinking capacity, moods, headaches, all of those things have been shown to be impacted by water intake. There's also some research that says you'll be much more content, calm, positive, and have much greater energy levels if you're having sufficient water. And there is your recipe. As I have added this before, so about 30 mils per kilogram of body weight if you're at rest, 40 mils if you're very physically active. Now, I love this slide because I'm an avid gardener, and I have to say I was really excited to find some research on the benefits of gardening. Apparently, the smell from a particular organism called Mycobacterium vacei, it's found in soil and in compost and in leaf mould, it will light up all those neurotransmitters that release serotonin, your happy hormone. So it's a mood-boosting thing that happens with just by smelling from this particular organism. So I thought that was quite remarkable. Now, I'll just go back. Now, gardening's also been shown to reduce negative emotions, boost positive ones, has a soothing impact on depression, stress, anxiety, tension and fatigue. It reduces fear, anger, and even helps with pain. And did you know that it can help you to even live longer? That's what the research is showing. And by the way, if you're doing gardening, it's a bit more vigorous. You know, if you're digging and raking and all those sorts of things, you're actually getting your exercise at the same time. So you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone there. So what else can we do? What other lifestyle factors can we get here? Regular restful sleep. We talked about this last night. 40% of people with insomnia will develop a mental health disorder, so that's why it's so important. And the risk of major depression when you are an insomniac is 40 times higher, so definitely important. We know it also contributes to memory impairment. I guess on the other side of if we're sleeping too much, over 9 hours will also increase our risk. So we really want to get to about 7 to 8 hours per night. And we learnt about some ways to do that yesterday. Avoid pessimism. Now, rather than me just say to be really optimistic, because The science doesn't support that. Science actually supports to be not negative. It seems like a bit of a confusion thing, but being pessimistic is a predictor of anxiety. So obviously that's a big issue. But when they looked at people who were optimistic, it didn't seem to have the effect that they thought. So all I can say is don't be pessimistic. If you do get a negative thought, then replace it with a positive thought, rather than having to be optimistic all the time. Obviously, having really good relationships and social supports, we know, and we've seen this in the pandemic, that isolation and loneliness will lead to a lot of issues with mental health, withdrawal, depression, all those things. So it's really important to have that sense of belonging. It will really improve your mental health overall. So, find meaning and purpose for your life. So what do I mean by that? Find something, even just something to give back to the community perhaps. And I think here you will really understand the next point as well, and that is daily spiritual exercises. So having an inner religious experience, so something that's actually quite meaningful to you in a religious sense, will help you to recover from depression a lot quicker than non-religious people. It also has been shown to prevent it, not just treat it. But I have to say here, it's not just having some sort of form of religion, like you might just have a bit of a simple belief system. It's actually those who actually have a commitment and they have a firm belief system that have those benefits. So that's really important. And obviously some examples here of how that helps. Daily reading of scriptures and daily prayer is really important for that. Now, what are some herbs and supplements that can help here? Let's have a look at some of those. Magnesium. Now, magnesium is really important to make your happy hormone serotonin. So it's really a wonderful relaxing mineral. So it's found naturally, of course, in all your leafy greens, your nuts and seeds, and all your legumes such as chickpeas and lentils and beans. So it's a really easy one to get naturally. Now, all the B group vitamins, I spoke to you about those before, the B6, the B12, the folate, so just make sure you get plenty of those in your diet. The other one is skullcap. Now, we mentioned this one yesterday in conjunction with sleep, but it's a herb that's really fantastic for anxiety, nervous tension, exhaustion, debility. So it's a really nice one to include. Valerian, very good as well, particularly with any sort of nervousness and anxiety again. Now, oats. Now, what I mean here is not necessarily the oats that you cook and make porridge out of, although that you will get some benefit from that. But I'm talking here about the green head of the oat. That's the one that's the most helpful. Now, it's a very old-fashioned nervous system or mind tonic, okay? So really good for those who've had quite long, debilitating depression. It's a beautiful herb for that, and it's very specifically indicated for depression, so it's a nice one to add. Passion flower. So we looked at this one particularly for insomnia, but again, it is really good for any sort of nervousness or anxiety, and it's good for nerve pain as well. Damiana. Now, it's a restorative herb, again, for stress and anxiety, and it's a nice one to add in too for those who might want to have a little bit of help with their sex life too. Withania. It's a root that has really nice calming abilities for the nervous system, particularly helpful for women who are going through menopause. So this one I like to use a lot in that circumstance where the mental health takes a big kick. So it's a nice one to add in there. Now, St. John's wort, it is quite a strong herb and not necessarily one to reach for first because it does interact with other medications and may be a problem for some people. But it does definitely help with mild to moderate depression, and it acts very similar to some of the medications that we use to treat both depression and anxiety. So it's a nice one if you haven't got any other reasons to not take it. And there you go. That's the end of my talk on mind health. Are there any questions? Yes, I'll get the microphone for a minute. We'll get the girls to come down. Okay, if those people can raise their hands again and the girls will be able to see you. Okay. Do you want to say your question from there and I'll repeat it?
So why about the guy who's the whole went through his head? Why did his whole character change?
So the Phineas Gage, who had the pole go through his head, his whole character change, because it wiped out the part of the brain where that had developed. So obviously his character, his personality, his ability to concentrate and focus and make plans, his moral abilities, all of those things were found in the part of the brain that got wiped out by the pole. So when the pole went through, he lost that part of his brain. It ended up on the ground out there. So he wasn't able to use that part of his brain anymore. However, like I said, interestingly, he did recover some of those abilities. So the brain was able to grow back some of those abilities with time, although he was never perfect again, that's for sure. Yeah. Sorry, there was someone, yep, back there. Sorry, there was one behind you, yeah, sorry.
Yep. Correct me if I misheard, but did you say you could eat eggs to get B12?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, yeah, that just, I mean, I don't eat eggs, but that just seemed like a bit of a contradiction to me because you said that saturated fat from animal products is bad.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So it's about a balance. I wouldn't recommend any more than 1 or 2 eggs a week as a natural source of B12. But yes, there are so many fortified plant-based products out there now with B12 that it's not necessary. I have some purists who don't believe in taking supplements or taking fortified products. And I say, well, you're going to have to get some B12, so no more than 1 or 2 eggs a week. And you won't get, obviously, it's about, working with what people can do, but that's the most I would recommend. Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
Yes.
What is white matter on the brain? I've had a friend that lost a baby from that, and then the second baby that came along also had the white matter on the brain. Didn't live long.
Oh, okay. So she didn't have the white matter, is that correct?
She did. The first baby had it for about 3 years, and then he passed away, and then the second baby also had the
Okay, so
white matter on the brain.
yeah, all of us do have white and grey matter in our brain, so there's a bit of a delineation between the two, and they do have different purposes. So obviously the cell bodies sit in one part and all the fibres run through the others. I'm not sure of the context of that. I suspect it sounds like part of that, the matter didn't develop with time, and so therefore their physiology couldn't continue. It was basically got to the point of they outgrew their own brain's capacity, which can happen. There are some quite tragic genetic disorders where the body basically starts to outgrow the brain's abilities and they pass away. Yeah.
What are the effects of singing and music on mental health? Singing and music.
Singing, yeah. Look, there's a whole talk I could do on that, and I actually have a friend who specialises in that area, and it's quite remarkable. There's some really good research behind the effects of music on mental health, positive as well as negative. So there are certain types of music, particularly classical types of music that don't use all that syncopated beats and all those sorts of things, that are very good and very healing to the brain, versus obviously the heavy metal type music and all those sorts of things, which are actually quite. The purpose of that is just to basically shut down that frontal lobe. So you can use music for both, really. You can use music to heal, and you can use music to harm. But yes, definitely. And it's a good thing to include in your health program, particularly if you have the ability to play music. It's a wonderful thing to include. Yeah.
There's a lot of conversation around cannabis oil at the moment, and food industries looking forward to hopefully the allowing it in food and beverage like it is in the UK and that kind of thing. Have you got any comments on that for managing pain? And
I will have to say I tend to avoid it more than anything. The issue that I have with cannabis or products related to that is that it's a bit of an unknown quantity still, and people's responses to it are very, what I would call idiosyncratic. Everybody's different. When I did work in the mental health unit, that was the problem. You know, you'd have someone coming in who may have been using some sort of cannabis product, were fine for a very long time, then all of a sudden they unmasked a psychosis. And you can't predict that. You can't predict the outcomes in people. Clinically, what I'm seeing now, I mean, obviously there are a lot more people using cannabis-based products to treat pain and a number of other conditions. And the effects are so variable that I can't predict it. So anybody who comes in and, you know, is referred off to get a trial of this, it's a hit and miss affair. And so that's why I haven't really promoted it. I haven't really, you know, actively used it in practice because of that concept. But I don't pretend to be an expert on it. My experience is more with what my patients are doing, and that's probably where I leave it. But it's not something, I mean, I'm a herbalist, but it's not a herb that I actually would use. I think I've got much better herbs that are safer, are more consistent in their response, and won't potentially unmask any mental health issues. Yeah.
For the herbs that you mentioned so far, do you use a supplement form? You buy it from chemist warehouse, or you get the herbal extract?
Yeah, so there are multiple ways that you can use herbs. If you would like to do something that was very self-directed, something you can do for yourself, I would suggest buying them as a tea, or as a tea leaf or a tea root, and making your own herbal teas. The other option is that, yes, a lot of those herbs you can find in a tablet form, and they're good. I mean, in Australia, we're quite good at regulating our practices of how we manufacture these things, so I don't have any problems recommending using them in tablet form. Quite frequently, you'll get a few of these in one tablet, so it's obviously a lot easier to take these than to make a tea. If you're wanting a herbal extract, though, you'll actually have to see a naturopath or a herbalist who can then make up the extracts into a formula for you. So yeah, in terms of what you can do and what you can purchase on your own, it's either the tea or the tea leaves, the tea root itself, or using the tablet form. Yeah. But yes, if you take that list to a chemist or a pharmacist, they'll often be able to find you something that might fit a few of those into one capsule.
I have other questions.
How much is about amount of herbs to make a tea? How long to stay in the hot cup? And what about mixing the tea?
Yep, absolutely. So, I mean, outside of the St. John's wort on that list, I would recommend having that in a tablet form, obviously not in a tea form. In that list that I have up on the screen there, all of those herbs, you probably need about 3 grams per day. So if you've got a little scale, it's even better if you're measuring your own teas, about 3 grams of each of those per day. Now, if you are measuring out leaves or flowers or the soft parts of the plant, it's quite easy to make that. You just measure it out, you put it into a cup, and you pour boiling water over it and let it steep for about 15 minutes. And then you can strain it and drink it. If you are using roots or the hard parts of the plants, then you will need to actually boil that one for 15 minutes. So you put it in the water and let it boil for 15 minutes rather than just pouring boiling water over it. If it's too time consuming and you'd like to combine both your roots and your leaves and flowers, etc., then an easy way to do it is just to actually grind your root down to a powder, and then you can just pour the boiling water over all of them. But you can literally just measure these out. My recommendation too is usually not having it all in one go, but have a gram of each of the ones that you would like 3 times a day. So you're having 3 cups of tea a day rather than just one very strong cup of tea. You get much better results.
Oh, sorry, I have 2 questions. It's all about food. Like you mentioned about fortified, like vitamin Bs. Like for example, in soy milk, they always have vegetable oil. So is it like take it as a balance, or is it not very good for you to take vegetable oil?
Yeah, look, there's different kinds of vegetable oils, so they're not all the same. But again, you're right, it's about balance. So even though we're trying to promote a whole food plant-based diet, sometimes there are things like, using plant-based milks is a much better option than using dairy options. So again, it is about balance, and just have a look at your labels of all your different plant-based milks. Some of them have lots of numbers in them, some of them have lots of additives, including processed sugars. So try to avoid the ones that have got, lots of numbers and extra sugars and things like that. But generally speaking, they may have a little bit of oil. There's a few things they do put in there, obviously for taste and for consistency. You just got to shop around. So there's a few brands. You can come and talk to me later. I'll talk to you about some of the brands that I've found that are better. But there are a few brands that are a little bit more wholesome in their ingredients. They might use whole soybeans versus a soybean extract, for example. So yeah, it's just basically doing your own sort of research on that and looking at the best options. Yeah.
I have one more question.
Yep.
Just about the sugar alcohol, because I know it caused diarrhea to somebody, but I'm not quite sure whether it's also related to yesterday's talk. Is that good for, not good, but then is it okay for people who, like in weight management and I guess in general health, is that okay to use it?
To use, sorry, what was that?
Sugar alcohol, like xylitol and erythritol.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So alternative forms of sugar, that's, yeah. So sweeteners and, look, the one that I tend to promote is just the stevia. So stevia, you can actually grow the plant and use the leaves as a sweetener. Extremely, extremely sweet and has no sugar in terms of its effect on you. It is a herb, but it does have that extra sweetener. So that's the one that I tend to recommend rather than the others per se. But yes, again, we're all trying to get a bit of balance. So if you're moving from a particular diet into a new diet, it's okay to use some things and just graduate yourself to a better diet. Yeah.
Right. You mentioned that the mindfulness meditation is actually bad for the frontal lobe. I'm just wondering, because it has been recommended by a lot of clinicians and therapists to deal with anxiety and in the period of anxious moment, being recommended to actually feel that present of now. What is the alternative way, and why is that really bad for your brain?
So, I mean, but the point is that the frontal lobe is also the source of a good mood. So the frontal lobe is a source where you develop that happiness, contentment, all those sorts of things. So we want to protect the function of that frontal lobe. The purpose of mindfulness in terms of trying to empty that is to shut down its function. And so it does leave it more open to, other things that you shouldn't be left open to. So when I talk about using healthy mindfulness, it's about focusing on good things. So for mindfulness here, that would be helpful would be to read something that's uplifting, something that's going to help you grow as a person, help you grow in your mind, and make better decisions, obviously make you look at things in a better light. So that's the type of mindfulness that's okay. Different to the Eastern form of mindfulness where you're trying to empty your thoughts and empty your mind, all those sorts of things. So there's two types. And to be honest, lots of people actually don't know what they're recommending. The research is not there to support that. It's very poor to support the emptying of the mind versus a mindfulness where you're actually doing something actively to support the positive function of your frontal lobe.
But when it comes to when someone is actually having anxiety and depression, it could be a little bit difficult for them to, when they read good things, it's hard for them to bridge that linkage, When they're depressed, they can't really feel anything good.
Yes.
So what is the best way to...
So don't have to necessarily use mindfulness as a means to address that. Why not use exercise or other means to address some of the anxiety and those sorts of things? So we do know there are other ways to improve your serotonin levels other than just using positive types of interactive mindfulness. So you've got to use multiple modalities to address it. I agree. When people are in that point of despair or in that point of severe anxiety, probably won't be able to address it through that means. But by the same token, putting them into a emptying of their mind does not help. It is not a long-term solution at all. It actually makes it worse in the long run.
Thanks for that. My last question is about hypnotherapy. Is that also good for depression, anxiety?
Again, you're shutting down the frontal lobe.
It's the same logic.
Same concept. Different angle, but a very similar concept. You're going to shut down that frontal lobe. It's really important there. Our frontal lobe is a source of our will, our morality, all of that stuff sits there. The last thing you want to do is shut down someone's frontal lobe. You can influence them in a way that's, you shouldn't be doing so. So you want to maintain the active function of that frontal lobe. Even if it's not functioning well, we cannot afford to shut it down. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to go... Hello? I'm going to start with a controversial question, and it's about mushroom psilocybin. Now, there's been discussions around it that has a lot of healing properties, and some people claiming to have spiritual divine interventions with it. What are your thoughts about
Sorry,
that?
I missed the first part. What was it?
It was about psilocybin mushrooms.
Oh, okay,
And
yes,
some
yes,
claiming
using
to have
mushrooms.
very strong healing experiences, those with PTSD and those with depression, those that have addictions, and some claiming to have divine interventions.
Yes. Yeah, no, I've sort of documentary on that recently. My thoughts on that, again, it's mind-altering substances. If you're going to take something that potentially is going to let you, basically your mind is not in your control, I don't think that's a safe thing to do. So that is what I believe personally. Certainly, we've got hundreds of years of experience of what happens when people are using mind-altering substances, both in the short term and the long term, and it's rarely a good outcome, despite the fact that these might be helping, with certain conditions for certain people. I would have to see what it was like across a large group of people to see what would happen with that. But yes, I've seen and I've read some of the things that are happening with some of these mushrooms. But they're, again, mind-altering substances. I think we should stay away from things that potentially we can't predict the outcome from.
So you'd rather have that to be suppressed rather than to have that chance for someone to heal themselves mentally and physically and spiritually?
I think there are better ways to heal people. I think we have much safer and better ways to heal people than to use mind-altering substances.
Okay.
Okay. All right, guys, I'm just going to invite my husband up for a minute. So if you want to come up, and he's just going to talk a little bit about tomorrow, and then I'll be back to talk about my final talk. Okay. Okay.
Good evening. Tomorrow night we start our series in which we'll have a look at, for 2 nights we're going to have a look at some prophecies that are nearly 3,000 years old, and the unbelievable accuracy with which they've predicted some of the world events that are happening to today. And I promise you that if you come and bring friends, that we will show you beyond all reasonable doubt that the Bible can be trusted as a book of prophecy. So we'll do that tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. We'll follow that up the next day on Friday with one of the greatest prophecies ever, and it is mathematically based, and it proved beyond all reasonable doubt that the very year, the very day, the very hour in which Jesus died had been predicted 900 years earlier. And it continues, that prophecy continues to show us today, again, the absolute accuracy of the Bible. On Saturday morning at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, we have 2 more presentations. One is based on Matthew 24, and that is Jesus predicted many things that would happen in our day, and they're all coming true. And again, I'll show you the statistics and show you the facts that these prophecies are being fulfilled to the letter. And then we will have a look at what I call an amazing future, which is what will the last night on earth be like? The Bible predicts that the earth will end. And we're going to go through and have a look at a prophecy on what that last night on earth will look like. So if you're interested in the spiritual realm and you're interested in the accuracy of the Bible, or you want to experiment and find out whether it is accurate, then I suggest you come tomorrow night. And And you'll have a chance to ask questions. We'll have a chance, I'll give out some cards and you can pen some questions. We will answer them the next night at the beginning. And, you know, people ask me all sorts of crazy things. In the last one that we did, somebody asked me, does God have a man for me, a good man for me? And I thought, well, you know, I am going to answer that even though I'm not an expert on those kind of issues. But people can ask all sorts of questions. So if you feel inclined that way, come along. And I ask those of you who are members of this place that you make an effort to invite somebody, because we're talking about people's spiritual existence. And we're talking about their eternal existence. So therefore, we should make an effort. You know, I leave my family and my children, and we go all over the world sharing this stuff with people. And I could think of more comfortable things to do with my life, but I don't do it. I'm not paid to do it. I do it because I believe in it. And so therefore, I urge you to invite your friends, especially those who want to know about the future and what the world holds for them. You know, we've just had 2 years of terrible uncertainty in this world. And those things have really shocked some people, and to ask the question, you know, where are we going, and what's the world has to offer for us. So please, come tomorrow night and invite somebody to come along. And I think we still have some invitations down the back. If you ask Lucky, he'll give them to you. Thank you. Rachel, we'll just have a, 5-minute break, and then 5-10 minute break, and then we'll look at her last presentation.
All right, everyone, we might move on to the last talk if we can. All right, so the final talk, I'm going to push into that last dimension of health I was talking about, which is spirituality, and how it all connects, how it is probably the main connection between everything that we do. And I have to say, after all of this week, these 8 lectures that we've had, you might be a little bit overwhelmed, or maybe you have embraced it all and are doing really well with it all. You know, you've adopted your whole food, plant-based diet and loving it, and drinking plenty of water, and doing your half an hour of exercise every day and getting lots of fresh air and sunlight. You know, all of those harmful habits that you may have had, you're starting to give up. So well done if you have. Or maybe you've just decided that it's all too much. Either way, I'm thankful that you came here and at least listened, and I was able to share that with you. But really, ultimately at the end of this, even if you have perfect health or no health at all, that's your choice. We all kind of ask the question, what does it all really matter? At some stage we do. It's something that we all arrive at. You know, what is our destiny, basically, if we want another word for it. So we're all going to ask these questions, you know, where do we come from? What are we doing here? Where are we going? All of these are just life questions that we do have at some point, no matter what our health is. And so this is actually the dimension of spirituality that we all have within us. We can't push that away. It's there. And so it doesn't matter if you've had an experience that's spiritual or not before, these questions always arise. And particularly in the teenage years, that's always going to be the case. Now, there isn't going to be any true healing or full healing without this aspect. You can't disconnect your physical, emotional, and spiritual health. They are all combined. They are one, so to speak. So you can't disconnect one from the other. So it doesn't matter how much physical things you can do in your life or how many emotional things you can do in your life. Without the spiritual, it won't come to anything. So this is why it's so important that we need to know about what eternity is, what a wholeness is that we have through something spiritual. And so there are lots of messages out there that might be spiritual, and it's hard to discern what's true and what's false. But I'm going to go through a few things and just have a look at some of the science of spirituality to start with. So, the science of spirituality. What does it do for our mental and emotional well-being? There's a really amazing scientist by the name of Harold Koenig. He actually put together a whole bunch of research into one source and looked at all of the articles and research that's been done on spirituality. And this is what they came up with, the benefits for their mental and emotional well-being. So it definitely improves your mental health and sense of well-being, gives you a greater sense of that purpose and meaning of life that we're all seeking, gives you a lot more hope and optimism, so a lot more positivity there. Definitely improves your self-esteem or your sense of self-worth. Definitely reduces your rates of depression and anxiety, suicide, substance abuse, so all of those mental health issues. Increases your recovery rate as well from depression. And it strengthens those social connectedness things that we have. So obviously how we connect to people is a lot more strengthened if we have spirituality. So that's the mental and emotional well-being, but what does it do for our health physically? Well, definitely improves your immune function, and we learned a little bit about what we can do in other aspects, but spirituality is really important there too. It lowers our death rates from cancer, so much better survival from cancer with spirituality. You have much better rates of heart disease when you have a spiritual life. Much better outcomes when you have heart disease. It lowers your blood pressure. You're far less likely to smoke cigarettes. Far more likely to exercise. You will sleep a lot better. And you will live longer. So there's definitely some mental and physical benefits to having spiritual connectedness there. So what I'm going to look at is how this all fits in with God. And so the whole concept of God and spirituality is one and the same, ultimately. And I really want to take you back to all of this in the Garden of Eden, because really this is where it all started, and there was a perfect health plan right front and centre there. So they had a proper diet, they had perfect food that was given to them. You know, God said he would give them every plant yielding seed and every a tree which has fruit yielding seed. In other words, they were eating lots of fruits and nuts. So very much a plant-based diet. And of course, when they were left the Garden of Eden after that, they were also given the herb of the field, so vegetables were added into their diet. Still, it was plant-based. And of course, they had a river running through, which would have the purest of waters, no impurities there or pollutants there. That was all perfect. He gave them exercise in the form of gardening. So he told them that they had to tend and keep the garden. So he gave them something that I don't imagine wouldn't have been a small task. I don't know how big the Eden was, but it would have been quite large. He gave them rest. So obviously they had rest from their work each day in terms of a daily period of rest. So each night, they would go to sleep. He also gave them a weekly rest in the form of a Sabbath as well. So, we have a number of days for the Earth to rotate around the sun. We know that takes about 365 days. We have the moon cycles, which give us a month. We have nothing in nature that tells us why we have a week, other than the story of creation. So it's there to tell us and remind us every week that we are created, and that when we spend some time with our Maker, we will be rejuvenated. At least if we can do that one day a week. They certainly had fresh air. They didn't have all the industrialization or the pollution that we have now. He gave them plenty of exposure to sunlight, natural sunlight, when they were gardening every day. He gave them companionship. So he took care of their emotional needs as well. He gave them each other. They were told to be fruitful and multiply, so they would have children, of course. So he was definitely taking care of their social and emotional well-being there. And he also made sure that he spent time with them. God himself would spend time with them daily, and also throughout their one day a week rest on the Sabbath day. So there you have the perfect health plan from God right there in Eden. They did introduce meat in the Bible story, and you're probably wondering when, if you haven't been aware of this. And this only came about after the flood with Noah. He did allow them to eat meat, but it was under very, very strict conditions. It was to have no blood in it, and there was a whole lot of rituals associated with preparing the meat as well, and a whole bunch of laws that they were to abide by. So it wasn't just the types of meat that we have today, which slap on a barbecue or, in the oven. These are different ways of preparing meat. Needless to say, we know that from the history in the Bible, that prior to the flood, it was quite common to live to over 900 years. When they were living on a plant-based diet, that seemed to be what happened. However, after the flood, we all know that generations that occurred afterwards, their living started, that the years that they lived started to reduce quite dramatically. By the time we got down to Abraham, he only lived for 175 years, Moses 120. Currently today, the average age of death around the world is around about 72. Now, in Australia, we're a bit higher because we've got modern medicines to keep us going and better nutrition available. We're sitting around about the 83 to 84. But definitely, with meat eating, came that loss throughout the generations of longevity. Then we go forward a little bit to the book of Daniel. And Daniel and his three friends, it's quite a remarkable story. This occurred obviously about 600 years before Jesus Christ came into it. And this is actually an example of the first controlled trial study. So long before scientists of our modern age came up with these terms, this occurred throughout the Bible. And this story is actually about Daniel and his three friends. They were young princes in Israel, and they were taken captive by the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, he was named. He was quite an amazing leader, though, Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't just go in and conquer a land and slaughter everybody there. He would actually take the young, well-educated, the very best, the cream of the crop of the young men there, and he would train them in his own universities and teach them to be his wise men. So quite a remarkable thing to do. They certainly you wouldn't see that these days. Nonetheless, he took these four young boys back to his kingdom to train in his university, but they were to eat and all the rich foods and drink alcohol from the king's table. He wanted to give them the best of his food. But these are not the foods that Daniel and his friends were used to. You know, they were used to a much simpler diet, and certainly based on a lot of the laws that God had given them about eating. So Daniel and his 3 friends approached their master, and they said, look, we're not happy to eat this type of food or drink these types of drinks. We would like to eat very simple food and drink water. Now, the master was a little bit concerned about this, but they had established a relationship with this master, and he agreed to give them 10 days to see how they would go. So they only ate plant-based foods and drank water. So this was the experimental group. All the other young men in this demographic were the control group. They were all the ones eating from the king's table. And so at the end of their 10 days, the master measured them. They were much healthier, much stronger than all their companions. So much so, he decided to let them continue their diet over for the next 3 years. And then they came before the king, The king then tested them. And the king found that Daniel and his 3 friends were 10 times better in their wisdom and understanding. So if there ever was a good example from the Bible of having a plant-based diet and fresh water, there is a really good one for you. So, there are 1,000 spiritual options out there. Which one is true? Which one is real? Some of this you will have to figure out for yourself if you haven't got there yet, but I'm going to show you what I have found to be true. So I didn't come to this at a young age. I became a Christian in my 20s, but I came there by doing my own research, my own reading, and obviously my own journey. So let me share with you what I have found with Christianity. I believe it provides a true picture of a God that I serve. So this one that gives us an insight into someone who is totally selfless and who is a giver and who is a creator. So number 1, he came looking for us. We don't actually have to go and find him per se. We're not trying to appease a God as lots of other religions will portray or go looking for him. He came looking for us. So he came down here to sacrifice himself for us. He was the one that provided that sacrifice and paid the price for what I had done wrong. So this is a completely different experience of what a God can be like. The other thing that I found that was quite beautiful is that even for those who choose to be lost, he will weep for those. And the Bible tells us he goes to weep in secret places for those who have chosen to be lost. So that is quite an amazing picture of a very totally selfless and loving God, and I love that picture. So therefore, as the Bible says, God is the only way, the truth, the ultimate truth, and the eternal abundant source of life and wholeness. So I really do believe if you're going to have healing that's physical, emotional, mental, you'll never have that complete until you include the Creator. The person that's given you life and is sustaining your life is your friend. Now, Napoleon once said, and I love this quote, my husband sometimes uses it in his presentations, Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I have founded empires. But on what did we rest the creation of our genius? Upon force. Jesus Christ founded his empire upon love, and at this hour, millions of men would die for him. And that's a beautiful summary of what even he knew. And that's because they did find a true leader in Jesus and their eternal friend. So, here's some prescriptions from me for spirituality. Read God's word. Check it out if you haven't already. This is where you would start to find out whether or not this is something that you find that is true. So this is where you'll be able to get to know this God, get to know his character of love. You will find the answers to all of these questions. Where have you come from? What are you doing here? What is the meaning and purpose of your life? What will happen when you die? All of these questions will be answered. There's a promise that you will find peace when you read his word and take it on board. The other thing that I encourage you to do, so even though the Bible was written for the whole world, it was also written for you as an individual. So when you're reading, individualize it for yourself. Another thing that's really really promising here is that when you find a promise in the Bible, even though it may look like something for somebody else, claim it for yourself. It's there for that purpose as well. It will actually test your faith and give you a strong and living faith. My second prescription is prayer. So it's another way to really build that faith and spirituality. And I would say pray simply. Pray to God as you would speak to a friend. You don't have to make it full of platitudes. You don't have to make it, very flowery or all-encompassing. Just pray simply, as He would be your friend. Pray when you read the Word of God. It kind of makes this a two-way conversation. The Bible is speaking to you, you speak to God, and it will just help you to understand things a lot better. Pray always, and what I mean by that is you don't have to literally stand here and pray all the time, but pray when you are happy, share your experiences with God. Pray in thankfulness, thank Him for things that you might have in your life. Pray when you're hurt or you're in need. So they're all the reasons that you can pray. Don't just pray to get things. Pray to also thank Him. Pray just to share an experience that you're having. And that's how we make friends with others. It's how we actually become a friend of God. And I always say, pray with humble expectation. I know that God has got your back and He wants to give you the best for what you need. Now, the last thing I'd like to share with you is a story that we find in the New Testament, and this is kind of an interaction between Jesus and a very, very poor soul, but we really see here that culmination between the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual well-being of an individual. If you want to find this story, it's found in the Bible in John chapter 5, but it is just a really amazing picture, and I'm just going to go through this. Some of you may already know this story. For those who don't, just listen along. So he was in Jerusalem one day, and there's a particular pool of water called the Pool of Bethesda. Now, around this pool, there laid a lot of very disabled people. They might have been blind, they may have been crippled, lots of sort of invalid or chronic conditions that needed healing. And why they were laying there is that there was a belief that when the waters moved or were stirred, there was sort of a supernatural force that could heal them if they could get into the water first. So that's what the belief was. And in fact, it was so powerful that it actually built all these porches around there so that people could lay there until the water started stirring. And there was just hundreds of people that would gather there to obviously try and get healed of whatever ailment they had. It was quite sad. Many people actually died on the brink of the pool. By the time they got there, they'd die before they even get in. But yeah, it was quite a sad place. But anyway, Jesus was walking there one day, and it was towards the, he was alone, and it was also a very spiritual day. It was a Sabbath, and he came along, and look, he was known for healing. He couldn't help himself. He loved to heal people and bring wholeness to them. But he had a problem. Because it was a Sabbath day, he was not so keen to heal everybody there, because he knew that there was some very legalistic people there who would think he was doing the wrong thing, and it would bring his whole mission to an end. So he was in a bit of a bind. But there was one particular man that he just could not help himself. He was very, very wretched. And this man had been a helpless cripple for about 38 years, so longer than even he had been on earth for. Now, it was most likely because of all his own poor choices and the sins that he had in his life, and it would have been looked on by others around him that this was a judgment from God. So you can imagine his mind was not in a good place. He was alone. He was friendless. He thought that, this was the end of his life. Now, over the years, despite being so close, he's never been able to make it to the edge of that water. He's never been able to get there. No one has ever been able to help him there either. So we're talking about a very desperate man who's just had continual disappointment for so long. Now, he was lying on a mat, just every now and then looking up, and then all of a sudden he sees a face there, and this face just looks over at him and says, "Will you be made whole?" That's all he was asked. And in that moment, he did have a bit of hope come into his heart. He thought maybe this was his chance, but I'd imagine that it didn't take too long for him to be discouraged. He would remember how often, obviously, that he tried to get to that pool and thought, you know what, it's not going to work. So he actually said to him, and this was Jesus that said to him, "Will you be made whole?" He said, "Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool, but while I am coming, another steps down before me. Now, Jesus didn't actually say to him, you need to exercise faith in me and have faith in me. All he said to him is, rise, take up your bed and walk. His faith did take hold, though, just at those words, and he did. He got up and he walked. And in this moment, you see just the beauty of it all. God, who created him, now recreated him. So every nerve, every muscle fibre that had withered away came back into those crippled limbs, and he was able to walk away. Now, he didn't question him. He still did obey God. So we still have to have that relationship with God to know that when he has our best interests in heart, we need to respond. And no, he didn't give him any assurance at that time. He just gave him that one command. So we do need to have and recognize that seed of faith within us, that when we hear that voice, we need to recognize it. And this is a man that represents all of us. All of us are damaged. We might be crippled by things in our lives, whether it's mental or physical or even spiritual. Now, if we are that crippled man and we are disabled in some way, I know that God is looking down on us and asking us the same question, will we be made whole? And I guess the choice is yours as to whether or not you want to rise up and walk in faith with him. So, you in your heart who are longing for something better than this world can give, recognize this longing as the voice of God to your soul. God is calling each one of us, will we be made whole? Will you answer him? Will you do that? I know that God is a gentleman. He doesn't force his way into your life. He doesn't barge his way into your life. He knocks on your door. He is loving. I know he is kind. He is forgiving. And whether you believe in him or not, he does believe in you. And he has an eternity that he's waiting to spend with you. And that can start today. For those of you who already know God, grow closer to him. For those who haven't met God, I encourage you to read the Bible, to start praying, and see where it takes you. Thank you. Alrighty, that's the end of my talks, everybody. I don't know that anyone will have questions about this one, but is there any? No? Great. Do you want to come up and just let them know about the talks? So I encourage you to come tomorrow, leading on from my talk. Rui is going to present to you why the Bible can be so certain, why you can have absolute faith in what the Bible says. So I'll leave that to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Rachel, and thanks everyone. And I'm sure we enjoyed every single night and all these 8 sessions. So if anyone wants, I know some of you gave me your emails, but if you want to have all these sessions to be sent to you by email or hard copy, please let me know. Rachel is going to send it to me an email, and then you did. Okay, beautiful. Yeah, and then I will give it to you. So if anyone wants, I got some paper here. I do have some. So if I can have your hands. So yeah, okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'll go. Okay, thank you very much for that. Yeah.
So I know there's quite a lot of people who actually wanted to speak to me about some things that are a bit more personal to them. I'm actually going to be here for the next few nights as well. So even though Rui might be talking, if you've got health concerns that you'd like to talk to me about and I don't get to you tonight, please feel free to come, tomorrow night, Friday night. I'll be here on Saturday as well. If you need to have a chat to me, more than happy to.
Thank you, Dr. Rachel. Just a little reminder about tomorrow night and Friday night. We will be having refreshments because we'll be finishing a little bit earlier. So just a little reminder to our cooks of church or fine ladies of the church just to bring some little finger foods or biscuits, and we'll be serving a little bit of hot tea and we can socialise a little bit. That's it all for tonight. So we hope to see you tomorrow night. Have safe travels home, and we'll see you tomorrow.